Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining in this evening. And today we are going to discuss one of the most important topics, I would say, if you are a student of world history, which is the feudalism debate. The feudalism debate is essentially a debate that studies a transition from feudalism to what we call capitalism. From feudalism to capitalism. So it is essentially a study in modes of production and means of production. It is a study that encompasses what we call in history, which is economic history. Economic history. From feudalism to capitalism, and we have to understand the economic implications of how that is happening. But let's start from scratch. From scratch, I mean, let us start from understanding what is feudalism and what is capitalism. All right. So feudalism essentially is what has been termed in historiography it's a mode of production. Mode of production in economic history means, and how people usually write it is MOP, which is mode of production. We see that it is how we organize economy, how we organize our economic transactions, how we organize economic life. If you ask yourself, what is economy? Economy is basically how people are interrelated with each other through transactions, through, let's say, labor, through, let's say, how we are working, how work is organized. Work, how people work. And in that, what I also want to discuss with you, which is essentially how the debate started. The debate essentially started with Karl Marx trying to talk about capitalism. And we should talk about Karl Marx. Karl Marx, in his one of the most essential books that you've heard is Das Kapital. Everybody knows Das Kapital, volume 1, 2, 3, which he wrote with Engels. But before coming to what he was writing in, let's say, early 1840s, 1830s, that is the early Marx. What I also want you to understand is early Marx. Before Marx gives us the theory of exploitation of the masses, of the proletariat, and how the proletariat is exploited, and he starts to revolt, which is the really revolutionary way that Marx talks about how the laborer, the worker class feels exploited by the capitalist class. Because Marx is studying the industrial, I would say, the industrial complex. He is studying industries, industrial work. And in industrial work, how the labor feels exploited by the capitalist, that is what Marx is studying. But before he comes to the idea of exploitation, he talks about a very important idea, which he writes in one of the early books that he writes, which is the German ideology. This book is early Marx, when he begins with the idea which I would like you people to understand is the idea of alienation. And I want to discuss this idea of alienation in brief, because alienation is what the worker feels when he is doing industrial work. In industrial work, the worker, in industrial work, industrial mode of production, the worker is alienated from his means of production. The worker feels alienated from his means of production. He feels that, imagine a person in the assembly line. An assembly line, everybody knows, everybody has seen it on National Geographic, Discovery Channel. Huge industrial complex. Industrial division of labor is a person doing specialized task. Let's say in a factory line, you are just putting caps in line so that the machine can do its work, right? You're just putting caps in line. You don't consume that cap. You don't use that cap. You don't make that cap. You are just giving your labor. You are just giving your labor in that assembly line, in that industrial work. You are alienated from that means of production. The cap, the industrial complex, everything, that entire structure, you are alienated from that. That it does not belong to you. The industry does not belong to you. You just step in there, give your labor in that industrial complex, and you come back and you are paid in cash. Marx feels that this laborer is alienated from his means of production, and that is exactly why he is exploited. He comes up with the theory of exploitation, because how will he, unite all the workers in order to, revolt? Nobody is going to be convinced that just because I'm alienated, I am going to, revolt against the capitalist class. It is not convincing enough. So that is why he had to come up with the idea of exploitation. That is exactly where all the economic contribution and the economic theory and all of this begins with Marx, because he feels that this alienation is at the very core, this alienation from the means of production at the very core of industrial work is what causes all the exploitation in labor. Now, why are we discussing that when we are talking about feudalism? Because in feudalism, the means of production is a piece of land. Feudalism is derived from the term fief or feud, stuff like that. All right. But the means of production is a piece of land, because this is the period in which we talk about feudalism per se, is the period from, let's say, the Middle Ages, what has been discussed in history as the Middle Ages, which begin roughly from 800 to, let's say, 1500, or let's say till the Industrial Revolution in 1750. All right, it's a long period when land is the most important means of production. Today also we need to understand the concept of, let's say, whenever you hear the idea of old money, aristocrats, patrician, all of these concepts and whatever that we listen to are derived from people who have all their money coming from landed estates. And the center of that landed estate used to be a medieval castle. All right, you can imagine it made of bricks. It used to have huge doors and stuff like that. So this used to be a structure. It's imagine, and this is where I urge all of you as students of history to really read or maybe watch something that is related to what you're studying. If reading is difficult, watch good shows that depict something like this. All right. If you want to, discuss something like, or understand medieval Europe, or let's say medieval society, watch shows like, let's say, The Night of the Seven Kingdoms or Game of Thrones or stuff like that. You will understand and see how people were living during those time periods. All right, now coming back to fief and feudal and mode and the means of production. The means of production is the land. Now this land is divided into huge parts, all right, which belong to the feudal lord. All right, the lord holds all this entire land, and serfs work for him. Serfs work for him. Now, what is the most important feature of feudalism and feudalism as a mode of production is that the serf is not alienated from the means of production. The serf works on this land, and the production is not for someone else. It is either for the serf himself or it is for the feudal lord. He is not alienated. He works on the land. He lives on the land. Say for example, this is like the whole land that the feudal lord is holding. All right. He's going to parcelize this land maybe to a tenant or a serf who is giving his labor to the feudal lord. All right. The serf works on this land. He lives on this land. He lives off this land because he produces what he's going to consume. All right. And in that context, the serf is not alienated from the means of production. He is alienated. He might be alienated from what is produced from, let's say, this land, but he is attached to the land. He is essentially living on and off the land. This is the major difference that we need to understand between feudalism and capitalism. Because let's say capitalism, it's a huge industry in which the worker is working. All right, he goes there, gives his labor, comes back, is paid in cash. Here, the serf is living over here, comes, gives services to the land, let's say, which is usually called corvée labor. All right, and in this, he has to give this labor to the feudal lord who owns what is called the demesne. This thing is called the demesne. This particular place is called the manor. Manorial privileges, if you must have heard it in your life sometime, somewhere. Manorial privileges. So it comes from living in a manor. It's called a manor, M-A-N-O-R. And this thing is called the land that the landlord owns, the feudal lord owns, is called demesne land. And the labor services that the serf gives to the landlord are called corvée services of labor. All right. Now he is giving off these labor services to the feudal landlord, and he is essentially attached to the land. He has got nowhere else to go. He's got nowhere to go. There are no other towns in which he can go to. There are very few towns. The population of, and this is what we are talking about, Europe. All right, don't imagine this to be India. We are talking about Europe. All right, we are talking about England per se, Spain, France, Germany. These are the countries that we're talking about, mostly Western Europe, because the studies from feudalism to capitalism, the debate, Marx is also sitting in the British Library in London. He is not going about town talking about revolution here and there, but he is working in England. This whole knowledge structure and all the scholars and everything that we are going to study in the next 25 minutes, all of them are from Europe or maybe from America, people who started studying about this in other places. All right. So this is the major difference between feudalism and capitalism, from land to the industry, from being attached to the land to being detached from the land, and the mode of production is not for consumption, it is for production somewhere else. In the industry, you are producing the goods for someone else. All the goods and cotton textiles in the Industrial Revolution essentially comes for cotton production, cotton textile production. All right, and it is not for European masses. It is the Industrial Revolution firstly comes to clothe the slave labor that is working in America. All right, it's a whole different politics, and we can discuss it later sometime. But here, what we are talking about is this shift from being attached to the land to being detached from the land, a shift from being attached to the means of production to being detached from the means of production. All right, and in that, the relations of production are going to change. There is going to be struggle for power. All history is about power. How much power can you accumulate in your hands? How much capital can you accumulate in your hands? That is all history mostly has been about. We're trying to move away from that. All right. So now, how did this debate begin? The debate began with Marx trying to define and talk about the capitalist society and the capitalist mode of production, and how the worker is alienated and he is exploited in the industrial complex. So people and scholars essentially started to study when exactly did Europe, shift from a system of, let's say, slave labor to serf labor to capitalist labor. So the whole debate begins with that. And the debate begins essentially with one of the oldest writings that have been there on, let's say, this particular period, the beginning of this particular period. And I urge you to read that book because it's a beautiful read. You should not read it like, reading a historical book. Read it like reading a novel. It's titled Muhammad and Charlemagne. And it is written by Henry Pirenne. It's an old book, a very, very old book. All right. And I think it was first written in 1937, if I'm not wrong. The book comes out in 1937, one of the beginnings of when we start to study the feudalism debate, because Henry Pirenne says that the rise of Islam, basically, the rise of Islam blockades the Mediterranean. All right. The Mediterranean Sea, this is where Europe is. All right. The rise of Islam over here, it blockades the Mediterranean and the whole long distance trade that was happening between Europe and the old world. And when I say old world, I mean India, Southeast Asia, China, Iran, per se. Because this has been a long trade that was going on since the time of the Roman Empire. It was going on since the time of the Hadappans. All right, it's a whole long history that we can go about and we can discuss. But Henry Pirenne says that when rise of Islam in the Mediterranean, in, let's say, this particular part of the Fertile Crescent, as I would like to call it, the Fertile Crescent, this whole part, Syria, Damascus, Jerusalem, and all these places. The rise of Islam blockades the Mediterranean and isolates Europe from the old world. That is when Europe becomes an inward-looking economy, an inward self-sustaining economy that can self-sustain only on that particular land. They are not producing, they are not consuming from outside the world. They are just producing what is produced from their own land and eating off of it. All right, this is what Henry Pirenne says, and it sounds very convincing. Almost, it's so straight-jacketed that you almost want to believe it. All right, but it's been debated. It's been, it has been crossed out because that is just not true. Because this whole trade and all of this was going on for a very long time, and the first person to actively, talk about and disregard this idea of Henry Pirenne, of this idea of commercialization, colonization, or let's say long distance world trade, is Maurice Dobb. All right, and we are going to come to Maurice Dobb and discuss. I think this is where we begin with the feudalism debate per se, because I like to open with Henry Pirenne because it's so simplistic that you almost want to believe it, and when it does not stand to be true, that is when the fun of history begins. That is when you start to believe that there's something better, something more complex happening. Because I don't like my students to believe that history is like a Karan Johar movie. Okay? It's not as simple as that. It's not a movie. It's not linear. It's very, very complex. And please don't try to simplify history at all. All right. It's my task to explain you concepts and stuff like that, but don't try to simplify something that is already complex. All right. Simplify it in your brain, but understand it to be complex in the first place. And now let's come to the complexity of this, because we are studying a transition from being attached to the land to being detached from the land. All right. Henry Pirenne says that the rise of Islam blockades the Mediterranean, and the Europe is now looking inwards only. Now, what is this inward looking thing? And now, but the simplicity of this argument can be disregarded simply by saying, not simply, but, understanding a key concept is that what about the internal dynamics of this relation? What about the relation of production that a serf had with the landlord? There is no explanation to that. What about how did this transition come about? Pirenne does not discuss that. All right. That's why I want you to read Henry Pirenne, if you can. All right. So now let's begin with the debate actually. And I'm going to give you a list of all of these scholars. Slowly, we are going to discuss, few lines about their argumentation. All right. And then I would urge you to read upon it. But I would simply like to introduce you to the transition debate. All right. So let's talk about Maurice Dobb. Maurice Dobb. Maurice Dobb is the first person to actively, debate, or let's say talk about this development of capitalism as a very much historical conception and a historical theory. He writes the book Studies in the Development of Capitalism. All right, this is the book, because I'm giving you the names of the book because in plenty of exams, what the question is asked either to talk about the argumentation of the author or the book that is written by the author. All right, this is the either or question. Usually match the following or negate or something of that sort. So you should know the author, his argumentation, and the book. And what I would also like to give you is the year when the book was written. Try to remember these things in a chronology, because sometimes the question, and let's say someone will ask is, arrange these books in chronological order. You can find that question anywhere. Sometimes primary sources are given, but today we are discussing essentially secondary sources. So you should also remember what came out first, because this is a question that can come in your exam. So Maurice Dobb in Studies in the Development of Capitalism, a book that comes out in 1946, is perhaps the first person to discuss this transition debate per se, or, he studies the development of capitalism. So he says, and which is what we should understand, is the inner contradiction model. He is a Marxist scholar, and he talks about inner contradiction. All right, he talks about inner contradiction. From here we begin with discussing certain Marxist scholars. We will discuss Paul Sweezy also in the middle, but we'll discuss the inner contradiction model, which says that feudalism as a relation of production was so problematic in the first place that it could not cope up with the rising warfare in the medieval time period, the rising, demand of the feudal lords for luxurious commodities and etc. So what they essentially do is that they keep exploiting the serf more and more and more until the serf, he gives in. But the serf can not actually give in. How will the serf give in? He does not own, let's say, weapons. He does not have weapons. All right. So how does the serf resist to such exploitation? All right. The serf resists through everyday resistant measures. All right. And this is an important argument of the inner contradiction model and Morris Dobb is everyday resistance and migration or fleeing en masse. Fleeing en masse. Fleeing en masse. All right. Mass scale pe you flee from the feudal fief, the demesne, the manor. You flee. But where do you go? You can't go anywhere. That's the question. And that is the internal contradiction in the feudal mode of production, that it cannot sustain the demands of the landlords and everything, which is essentially what Dobb and the Marxist school believes, is that there is an internal contradiction between, you know, the relations of production in feudalism. All right. And this is exactly where we understand the idea of inner contradiction. It's a contradiction. It's a struggle. How do you do it? There is a rising demand. You are being exploited. How do you revolt? You're not able to revolt. You migrate, but you go where? There are no big towns. You migrate to big towns, but then you do what? You can't just cultivate a town on your own. You need something from yourself, something. You need something. All right. So the inner contradiction model, it's huge, it's complicated, but that's the most important argument, is that there is exploitation, and then there is resistance, and then there is migration en masse. And, you know, there are certain concessions that the landlord ultimately gives them. And what he does is that, what the landlord does is that he, from the piece of land, he says that, okay, you are free, but you can come and cultivate this, and you will be given payment in cash for your labor. You are free. You can go away from this particular piece of land. All right. But what does he do? What does the serf do? He is given the option is that you can come back over here and you can give your labor and I will pay you in cash. All right. Now he gets cash. The serf gets some cash, but then he is also taxed. He's taxed a lot. There is tithe, there is tile, the church, the state, everybody is taxing him. So he's got very little in his own pocket after even giving his labor. But at least he is detached from the land for a change. He is now free to do or give his labor. He can save up, even if it's like maybe, you know, just a penny out of a shilling that is being given. It's just a paisa out of a rupee. All right. But that is where the change begins. And the Marxist school believes that this is the internal contradiction. This leads to a putting out system from which, you know, later changes happen. Now let's quickly move to other people who are saying that, which from Morris Dobb we move to a person named Paul Sweezy. All right. Paul Sweezy and Morris Dobb, they are the two people who are constantly in historiographical debate. And Paul Sweezy is the first one to, you know, oppose the idea of Morris Dobb and the Marxist school. And he says that, no, it was the towns that provided, you know, the basis of the rise of capitalism. This is what Paul Sweezy is going to say. He's going to say the towns, it is where from the towns, from where the demesne land, the people migrate to towns, and in the towns, the merchants and the merchant guilds, they give certain, you know, limited resources to the serf, and he has to work for them. And he ultimately starts, because this town, they see the town as a safe haven from the demesne. From the demesne to the town, which is a safe haven. They see the town as a safe haven. So the prime mover for Paul Sweezy, and Paul Sweezy's book is The Theory of Capitalist Development. It comes out in 1946 only. It is, and he also writes a book called Transition from Feudalism to Capitalism. But one of the most important works is Theory of Capitalist Development. And I think you should remember that, and I will give it to you. Theory of Capitalist Development, and it also comes out in 1946. All right. And in this book he talks about this idea, and he is debating with Paul Sweezy. ultimately both of them, they start writing rejoinders and stuff like that. So it's a whole lot of debate, the inner contradiction versus, you know, this, the towns and the safe haven, the commercial model. They say because this is the prime mover, and yes, prime mover is something that we need to understand. The prime mover. The prime mover, because you see the debate is going to be almost people talking about same bit of processes or different processes from a different perspective. So what we need to focus on is what is the prime mover for each author. You need to remember the prime mover of each author. So for Paul Sweezy, the prime mover of the shift from feudalism to capitalism is the town. The town and, let's say, the merchant. I'm sorry, merchant. Please don't mind my handwriting. Merchant. The merchant or the town becomes the prime mover for Paul Sweezy in order to, you know, the shift from that, because they are the people that, you know, employ the putting out system. They employ the fleet, you know, serf in the town. All right. Now in that, what we should also talk about is Emanuel Wallerstein. I want to discuss Wallerstein before I discuss Robert Brenner, is because Robert Brenner is too vast. We have to discuss Robert Brenner because Robert Brenner is one of the most important persons to discuss, you know, and understand the inner contradiction model. All right. But before that, I would like to, because we just did Paul Sweezy, let us talk about Emanuel Wallerstein. Emanuel Wallerstein. Wallerstein gives us the idea of the modern world system. The modern world system. And his book, which comes out in 1974, he talks about modern world systems. Volume 1, basically. Other volumes also come out. So he talks about the modern world systems, and in that he divides the world into core, periphery, and semi-periphery, and external spaces, stuff like that. But these two things are most important for you. You should understand what the core is and what the periphery is. For Wallerstein, the core is Western Europe. The core is Western Europe, and he says from Western Europe, in Western Europe, there is a agricultural crisis. Agricultural crisis. He essentially calls the feudal crisis or feudalism to capitalism as a result of, you know, a crisis in agriculture, because they are unable to produce more for the rising population. All right. So from 1492 onwards, 1492 is important because this is when Columbus lands on America. All right. So he says that the age of colonization and exploration and everything, it begins because of a crisis in the feudal system, which is essentially an agrarian crisis, because they have to shift to new lands to find food. And that is when, you know, the islands of Madeira and all the islands, Azores Islands that are just next to Portugal, they are colonized first. And what happens over there is cultivation. They need cultivation, they need food, which is for which they venture out. All right, which is for which the Europeans venture out. And he says they venture out and then they exploit the periphery for the benefit of the core. Exploitation of the periphery for the benefit of the core. Western Europe is going to benefit from the periphery. Periphery is basically America, Africa, Asia, wherever they colonize. So so Wallerstein becomes part of the colonization model or the mercantilist model, because this is what leads to the rise of mercantilism in around, you know, the 16th century. All right. And they say that this is when Europe globalizes the world, it revolutionizes the world, and Europe ultimately uplifts itself from feudalism and becomes essentially a capitalist economy. And the prime mover for Wallerstein becomes the age of exploration, or colonization. Exploration and colonization are essentially the prime movers for Wallerstein, and that is how he would like to define how this change happens. Now let's move to one other important school of thought, which is the Malthusian, or let's say the Annales school. The Annales school. The Annales school is famous for studying longue durée processes. Longue durée processes, it's a French word. You understand history not just in parcels, but as a long duration, not just so basically not studying parcels but studying history in long duration, because that is when the trends of economy come to life. So Annales school gives the demographic theory of it is also sometimes called the demographic model, because it talks about the rise and fall of population in Europe, population trends. Population trends in Europe. The population rises, the population falls, and the population rises again, the population falls. And in that, I would like to give you an author which I find is pretty interesting and pretty important from this point of view. The author is named Guibois. Guy Boys, you can say, but the correct pronunciation is Guibois. All right. And Guibois, essentially he talks about the tendency of the feudal levy to fall, the tendency of corvée that we were talking about, the tendency of corvée to fall eventually. And when the corvée falls, the laborer is free to do something else for himself. So when the population rises and the population falls, the corvée is proportionally related to that. Now what happens is that when there is rising population, there's going to be rising rent. When there is more population, there are more serfs. If there is higher population, there's going to be higher serfs. All right, more number of serfs to work. So they would be willing to pay more rent on the land that is meted out by the landlord to them. So they would pay more rent. So the rent would rise. All right, if there is a rise in population, the rent rises and falls. If the population rises, the rent also rises. Population rises, the rent rises. But when the population falls, the rent falls. So the Annales school says that in the time of feudal period, there is an important event that all of you should note, and that important event is the Black Death. The Black Death that comes somewhere in the middle of the 14th century, which is around 1348 to 1350. It is you can write 60 also. I mean, I don't mind, because it essentially comes in the middle of the 14th century, which is a bubonic plague that wipes out 1/3 of the population of Europe. 1/3 of the population of Europe dies. So what the Annales school says is that when 1/3 of the population is going to die, there are fewer serfs to work on the demesne land of the landlord. So there is going to be less rent, because there is less population leads to less rent. Because of Black Death, there is decline in population and there is decline in rent, because the bargaining power of the serf is going to rise, because he knows that landlord does not have other serfs to work for him because people have died. All right. So if I know I'm the only laborer over here, he's going to pay me as much as I want for my labor, and therefore there's going to be decline in rent. All right. Even in COVID, you must have noticed that the rents for, let's say, marriage gardens, or let's say for living, they declined because the landlords knew that people are going back to their households, because they are going back to their homes. All right. If they are going back to their homes, who is going to pay them the rent? Because the landlord has got his mentality that he does not want to work. All right. And if he does not want to work, what he wants is that I've got a place, a means of production, and people should come over there and work for me. All right. So he has got a piece of land, he's got a house. All right. He does not want the tenant to leave. And if he does not want the tenant to leave, what he has to do is that he has to decrease the rent. So the annals say that after the Black Death, the decline of population leads to the decline of rent, and therefore the feudal levy falls. The feudal levy, the declining tendency of the feudal levy, which is the argument of Guibois, he says that the feudal levy falls. And Guibois does this in the book, which he says The Crisis of Feudalism, Economy and Study and Society in Eastern Normandy. The Crisis of Feudalism. The text that he writes is The Crisis of Feudalism. And if I'm not wrong, this work comes out in 1984. All right. So, and with Guibois, you can understand the demographic school. If you read Guibois, or let's say people like Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, or let's say M.M. Postan, these are all Annales school historians. I can give you names of these people, and you can comment the names of these, the books that they have written. Postan, M.M. Postan, there is Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie. They all talk about the demographic reasons for the decline of feudalism. All right. Now, before we conclude, I would like to talk about Brenner briefly and then Weber. So, Robert Brenner is one of the most important names when we study the transition debate or the feudalism debate. Robert Brenner is one of the most important people because, again, he's a Marxist. He talks about the inner contradiction in, let's say, studying the agrarian structure. His text is also titled The Agrarian Structure and Economic Development in Pre-Industrial England, or pre-industrial Europe. Robert Brenner is an American, so he specifically he's not worked essentially only on Europe. He's worked a lot on industrial revolution and something of that sort. But he talks about the agrarian structure. The text is also the agrarian structure and the beginning of, the beginning of capitalism, agrarian structure and economic development in the pre-industrial Europe, agrarian structure and economic development in pre-industrial Europe. All right. So again, please don't mind my handwriting. So why do we need to study Brenner? I mean, because Brenner talks about the case study of England, he talks about the case study of France, and he is essentially talking about class relations, class struggle, and class power. I think it's one of the most wholesome understanding of the inner contradiction model that you can get with Robert Brenner and his agrarian structure, because he talks about the changes in class relations, the changes and how the class struggle comes about, and how class power is transformed when we move from feudalism to capitalism. And he talks about class struggle and class power in England and France. And he talks about that in England and France, and he gives the two cases. What he says is that in England, what happens is that Henry VIII wants to marry, he actually wants a divorce because the wife that he has currently does not give him a male heir. So he turns to Protestantism. When he turns to Protestantism, he converts the entire country Protestant, and he puts the entire land of the church on sale. He puts the entire land on the church for sale, and what happens is that the landlords, the rich peasants, universities or stuff like, and people like that, they buy that land. So what they do is that they enclose and evict. They enclose and evict the serf. So basically, with that, the process of the alienation of the serf from the land happens. The power it transfers from old landlords to new landlords. There is an argument that is given that there is a transformation of the new gentry, and the landlord turns into, let's say, the progressive English landlord, or let's say the agricultural manager English landlord. So what he says is that the landlord, instead, earlier they were, part of wars, landlords and knights and everyone, they were participating in wars. But what happens is that it's a policy of isolation that England follows, is that they don't participate in wars. Instead, they become good agricultural managers. And this is an argument that is also put forward by Perry Anderson also. All right. So he says that in England, the state supports this agrarian transformation of class power and class relations and class struggle, and the state ignores the plight of the serfs, that they are separated from the means of production, because the serfs now, they have got nowhere to go. They have to convert to, let's say, tenants, or let's say they have to migrate to towns or something of that sort. So he says that the enclosure and the eviction of the peasants and all of this, that leads to the transformation of, or let's say transition from feudalism to capitalism in England. But in France, what happens is that there is a difference, because the state does not turn Protestant, the state remains Catholic, the state supports the peasant community in France. So there is, tightening of feudal control, and that is why England industrializes earlier than the rest of the Europe. We know that England industrializes before France or Germany or England or Italy or anyone else. So by the time of the French Revolution also, which is 1789, we don't see industrialization in France. We have to wait till the revolutions of 1830 and 1848 for that to come about. So that is the difference. And the transformation of that Henry VIII, that is happening somewhere around the 17th century. And so you see, that is the difference, and these are the two case studies that Robert Brenner practices. Now, before we close, and this is the last point that I want to talk about, because we've talked a lot about other things, which is one argument that I would like to give, which is by Max Weber. And I am sure you must have also heard about it, which is Protestant ethic. The Protestant ethic. Max Weber says that religion was the prime mover for the shift from feudalism to capitalism. Weber says that it is the Protestant ethic that gives a sort of a safe breathing mentality to the serf, and now he believes that he has a calling. The Protestant ethic talks about, when we can discuss that sometime later, Renaissance or Reformation, John Calvin, Martin Luther, they talk about a calling of an individual. And the serf, when he's detached from the land, because that was the time when he does not have a calling or something of that sort, he detaches from the land, and that is when he has got the idea of doing something for himself. That is when his manumission actually happens, and that is when he transits from being a serf to, let's say, a worker or something else. So Weber, and his book comes out in, I believe 1905, I guess, if I'm correct. That is the first time when Weber gives the idea of the Protestant ethic, and the book is titled Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. If I would like to, give you the whole name of the book, the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. All right, this is the book, and for him, the Protestant ethic is the prime mover for the shift from feudalism to capitalism, because it gives them the spirit to actually work outside of the feudal lord's manor. All right, so with that, I would like to conclude today's lecture. And we've discussed so many things today. We've discussed Weber, we have discussed Robert Brenner, we have discussed the Annales School, we have discussed Wallerstein, we have discussed Paul Sweezy, and we have discussed Maurice Dobb before we started off with Henry Pirenne in the very first place. So now I would like to end it over here, and we will meet later. And soon we're going to be beginning with offline classes. If you have any queries, you can put down it on the comments, and I will reply back to you. Thank you so very much. See you later.